Hello. Before you read this book, there are some things you should know, so Harold and I have created this informative pamphlet to fill you in on the details. Please don't let this comic fall into the wrong hands. The Top Secret Truth About Captain Underpants by George Beard and Harold Hutchins, who deny everything. Once upon a time, there were two cool kids named Georgian Herald. We are cool. Me too. They made their own comics about a superhero named Captain Underpants. Tra-la-la! Everybody thought their comics were funny. Ha 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 ha! Except for their mean old principal, Mr. Krupp. Blah blah blah! One time, Mr. Krupp was being mean to Georgian Herald. Blah blah blah! So they bought the 3D hypno ring. They hypnotized Mr. Krupp. I will obey. Then they turned him into Captain Underpants. But Mr. Krupp thought he really was Captain Underpants. He jumped out the window to fight crime. Uh-oh, tra-la-la! Georgian Herald tried to stop him, but they had to save the world first. Bad guy. Kaboom! When they got back to school, George poured water on Captain Underpants' head. He turned back into Mr. Krupp, but something was wrong. Blah, blah, blah. Because now, for some strange reason, every time Mr. Krupp hears somebody snap their fingers, snap, he turns back into Captain Underpants. Tra-la-la! So whatever you do, please don't snap your fingers around Mr. Krupp. Please, 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 don't snap those fingers. This has been a public service announcement from Georgian Herald, who still deny everything. The end. Chapter 1, Georgian Herald. This is George Beard and Harold Hutchins. George is the kid on the left with the tie and the flat top. Harold is the one on the right with the t-shirt and the bad haircut. Remember that now. Joe's Furniture. Come in and see our pretty armchairs. Depending on who you asked, you probably hear a lot of different things about Georgian Herald. Their teacher, Miss Ribble, might say that Georgian Herald were disruptive and behaviorally challenged. Their gym teacher, Mr. Meaner, might add that they were in serious need of a major attitude adjustment. Their principal, Mr. Krupp, would probably have a few more choice words to include, like sneaky and criminally mischievous, and I'll get those boys if it's the last thing well, you get the idea. But if you ask their parents, they'd probably tell you that Georgian Herald were smart and sweet and very good-natured and very good-hearted, even if they were a bit silly at times. I'd have to agree with their parents. But even so, their silliness did get them into a lot of trouble. Sometimes, in fact, it got them into so much trouble they accidentally almost destroyed the whole planet with an army of evil, vicious, talking toilets. But before I can tell you that story, I have to tell you this story. Chapter 2, This Story. One fine morning at Jerome Horwitz Elementary School, George and Harold had just gotten out of their 4th grade remedial gym class when they saw a big sign in the hallway. It was an announcement for the 2nd annual Invention Convention. George and Harold had fond memories of last year's Invention Convention, but this year's convention was a bit different. The first prize winner got to be principal for the day. Wow, said George, whoever gets to be principal gets to make up all the rules for the whole day, and everybody in school has to follow those rules. We've got to win first prize this year, exclaimed Harold. Just then, George and Harold's principal, Mr. Krupp, showed up. Aha, he shouted, I'll bet you two are up to no good. Not really, said George. We were just reading about this year's contest. Yeah, said Harold, we're going to win first prize for the contest and be principals for the day. Ha 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 ha, laughed Mr. Krupp. Do you honestly think I'd let you two enter this year's contest after that stunt you pulled at last year's convention? George and Harold smiled and thought back to the first annual Invention Convention. Chapter 3, The Flashback, last year's Invention Convention. It was about 1 year earlier, and all the faculty and students at Jerome Horwitz Elementary School gathered in the gymnasium for what would later be known as the sticky chair incident. George and Harold stepped up to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, said George, Harold and I have invented something that is guaranteed to keep you all glued to your seats. Yes, said Harold, we call it glue. Mr. Krupp became very angry. You two did not invent glue, he shouted. He stood up to take the microphone away from Harold, and his chair stood up with him. Everyone in the gymnasium laughed. Their school secretary, Miss Anthrop, stood up to help remove Mr. Krupp's chair from his pants. Her chair stood up with her, too. Everyone in the gymnasium laughed harder. The other teachers stood up and, you guessed it, they were stuck to their chairs as well. Everyone in the audience howled with laughter. One kid stood up to go to the bathroom and his chair came up with him also. The audience stopped laughing so hard. They all quickly checked their chairs and suddenly the laughter stopped completely. Everyone in the whole school was glued to their seats. You see, while it was true that Georgian Herald had not invented glue, they had invented a new kind of glue. By simply mixing rubber cement with concentrated orange juice mix, they had created a quick-drying, body heat-activated glue. Then they applied the special glue to every seat in the gymnasium except theirs early that morning. Everybody in the gymnasium was glaring at Georgian Herald and seething with anger. I got a good idea, said George. What? Asked Harold. Run! Cried George. George and Harold were grinning from ear to ear, remembering their silly invention and the chaos that followed. That was hilarious, laughed Harold. Yeah, chuckled George. It'll be hard to top that this year. Well, you won't get a chance this year, said Mr. Krupp. He took out a magnifying glass and held it up to the fine print on the sign. This contest is open to all students in the 3rd and 4th grades except George Beer and Harold Hutchins. You mean we can't enter a contest? Asked Harold. It's worse than that, laughed Mr. Krupp. You boys can't even attend this year's convention. I'm putting you two in study hall that whole day. Mr. Krupp turned and walked away, laughing victoriously. Rats, said Harold. What are we going to do now? Well, said George, you know the old saying, if you can't join 'em, beat 'em. Chapter 4, The Invention. Electric Apple, Automatic Shoe, Patsy 2000. Early that evening, George and Harold sneaked back to school with their supplies. They crept into the gymnasium and peeked around. I think somebody's still in here, whispered Harold. Oh, it's just Melvin Sneedley, said George. Melvin was a school brainiac. He was busy putting some last-minute touches on his new invention for the contest. We should wait here until he leaves, whispered Harold. No way, said George. He could be here all night. Let's just go over and talk to him. When Melvin saw George and Harold approaching, he was not happy. Oh no, he said. I'll bet you guys are here to mess with everybody's inventions. Nice guess, said George. Listen, we promise not to mess with your invention, if you promise not to tell anybody that you saw us here tonight. Melvin looked lovingly at his invention and reluctantly agreed. I promise, he said. Great, said George. Say, what is that invention of yours anyway? It just looks like a photocopy machine. Well, it used to be a photocopy machine, said Melvin, but I made some major adjustments to it. Now it is an invention that will revolutionize the world. I call it the Patsy 2000. It'll revolutionize the world, and you named it Patsy? Asked Harold. Yes, said Melvin. Patsy is an acronym for Photoatomic Transungobulating Ectophan Triplutonic Zamziptomizer. I'm sorry I asked, said Harold. Allow me to demonstrate, said Melvin. The Patsy 2000 can take any two-dimensional image and create a living, breathing, three-dimensional copy of that image. For example, take this ordinary photograph of a mouse. Melvin placed the photo of the mouse onto the glass screen of the Patsy 2000 and pressed start. The lights in the gymnasium dimmed as all the power in the entire school seemed to get sucked into the Patsy 2000. Soon the machine began to vibrate and hum loudly, and tiny bolts of static electricity snapped out from underneath. I hope that thing doesn't explode, said Harold. Oh, this is nothing, said Melvin. You should have seen how the Patsy 2000 reacted when I copied a poodle. Finally, after a series of flashes and loud zaps, everything stopped. A small ding was heard, then a tiny mouse crawled out the side door of the Patsy 2000 and onto the floor. Isn't it wonderful? Exclaimed Melvin. George inspected the mouse closely. That's a great trick, George laughed. It's not a trick, cried Melvin. The Patsy 2000 really does bring photos to life. I've even created living creatures from paintings and drawings. Yeah, right, laughed Harold, and I thought we were con artists. George and Harold walked away chuckling. It was time to move on to bigger and better things. Chapter 5, Bigger and Better Things. George and Harold went to the other end of the gymnasium, opened their backpacks, and began to work. George busied himself by turning all the spray nozzles on the automatic dog washer around, while Harold filled up the soap tank with India ink. Then they moved on to the volcano detector. Will you please pass me the big bag of butterscotch pudding and a Phillips head screwdriver? Asked Harold. Sure, said George as he carefully inserted eggs into the electric ping-pong ball server. Chapter 6, The Invention Convention. The following day started out sunny and cheerful. The students and faculty filed into the gymnasium and checked the seats very carefully before sitting down. "Greetings," said Mr. Krupp, who was standing up to the microphone. "You don't need to worry about sticky seats today," he said. "I've taken measures to ensure that this invention convention won't be a disaster like last year's." Everyone settled in as Madison Mancini, a third grader, stepped on stage to demonstrate her automatic dog washer. "First," said Madison, "you put your dog in the tub, then you press this button." Madison pressed the start button. At first nothing happened, then suddenly a spurt of inky black water sprayed up and out over the crowd. Everyone except the dog got soaked as Madison tried desperately to turn off the sprayers. "I can't stop it," she cried. "Someone turn all the nozzles around." "Now who could have done that?" asked Mr. Krupp. Next up was Donnie Schumeyer with his electric ping-pong ball server. He turned the machine on and immediately it began hurling extra-large grade A eggs into the ground. "Foop, foop, 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 foop," went the machine. "Splat, splat, 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 splat," went the eggs. "I can't turn the machine off," cried Donnie. "Somebody jammed a paperclip into the controller." "Now who could have done that?" asked Miss Dribble. Freddie Moore's volcano detector was also a big flop. When Freddie connected the circuits to the 9-volt battery, a large spring, which had been crammed into the center of his miniature volcano, launched a giant plastic bag of butterscotch pudding high into the crowd. It landed somewhere between the third and fourth row. Splat! "Hey," whined Freddie, "somebody put pudding in my volcano." "Now who could have done that?" asked Mr. Meaner. The rest of the day went on much the same way, with people shouting everything from, "Hey, who put oatmeal in my solar-powered leaf blower?" to, "Hey, who let all the mice out of my treadmill dune buggy?" It wasn't long before everyone fled the gymnasium, and the second annual invention convention had to be called off. "How could this have happened?" cried Mr. Krupp as he wiped chocolate syrup, pencil shavings, and cream of mushroom soup off his face and shirt. "Georgian Herald had been in study hall all day long. I put him there myself." Excuse me, Mr. Krupp," said Melvin Sneedley. "I think I have an answer to your question." Chapter 7, Busted! Crash went the door to the study hall room. Mr. Krupp stomped in like a crazy person. Georgian Herald had never seen him this upset before. "You boys are in so much trouble," Mr. Krupp shouted. "I'm putting you two on permanent detention for the rest of the school year." "Wait a second," cried George. "You can't prove anything." "Yeah," said Harold. "We've been here all day." Mr. Krupp smiled devilishly and looked toward the door. "Oh, Melvin," he called. Melvin Sneedley stepped into the room, covered in mustard, eggshells, and shredded coconut. "They did it," Melvin said, pointing at Georgian Herald. "I saw 'em last night in the gym." "Melvin!" cried George, horrified. "You promised." "I changed my mind," Melvin said, grinning smugly. "Have fun at detention." Chapter 8, The Invention Convention Detention. After school, Mr. Krupp ushered George and Harold into the detention room and wrote a long sentence on the chalkboard. "From now on," growled Mr. Krupp, "you boys will spend 2 hours a day after school copying this sentence over and over. I want every chalkboard in this room filled completely." On his way out the door, Mr. Krupp turned and said with an evil grin, "And if either of you leaves this room for any reason, I'm going to suspend you both." I will never do anything which angers my handsome and charming principal, Mr. Krupp, ever again. Now, as you might have guessed, writing sentences was nothing new to George and Harold. The two boys waited until Mr. Krupp left the room. Then they each took 4 homemade wooden rods out of their backpacks. The rods had holes in them that George and Harold had drilled in George's dad's workshop. George screwed the rods together while Harold inserted a piece of chalk into each hole. Then they each took a pole and began copying Mr. Krupp's sentence. Every time they wrote one sentence, the wooden poles made 12. After about 3.5 minutes, every chalkboard in the room was completely filled. George and Harold sat down and admired their work. "We got a lot of time on our hands now," said George. "Got any ideas?" "Let's make a new comic book," said Harold. So the two boys took out some paper and pens and created an all-new adventure about their favorite superhero. It was called Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets. Chapter 9, Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets by George Beer and Harold Hutchins. Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets. Story by George Beard, pictures by Harold Hutchins. One day at school, everything was pretty normal. The lunch ladies were serving toasted rat sandwiches, the principal was yelling blah blah blah, and the gym teacher was being mean to everybody. My grandma can run faster than you guys. Then a UFO appeared. It zapped the school with an evil ray. The ray made all the toilets come to life. It made them evil too. The toilets were hungry. Yum, yum, eat 'em up. So they ate the gym teacher. Help, the toilets just scratched somebody's car and ate the gym teacher. Lord have mercy, was it my car? This looks like a job for Captain Underpants. Crash. Captain Underpants ran to the storage room. Yum, yum, eat 'em up. He found a bunch of plungers. He put them in the toilets. Their mouths got stuck. Tra-la-la! Hooray for Captain Underpants! Now to stop that evil UFO. Captain Underpants went outside and saw the UFO. It opened up. Click! And out jumped the terrible Turbo Toilet 2000. I'll flush you. They had a big fight. Captain Underpants was faster than a speeding waistband, more powerful than boxer shorts, tra-la-la, and able to leap tall buildings without getting a wedgie. Captain Underpants snuck up behind the Turbo Toilet 2000 and gave him a wedgie. Wedgie power! Ouchie! Then he hung the TT-2000 on a stop sign and pulled back hard. Then he let go. Twang! Kaboom! The spaceship blew up and all the toilets returned to normal. Hooray! Even the gym teacher escaped. Aw, man. The end.